At the 48th Phyllis Schlafly Eagle Council, we sat down with Alex Newman, author of Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. Alex Newman, great to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Great to be with you. Thank you again.
You're the author of Crimes of the Educators, and you had a very provocative talk last night, and I wanted you to tell me more. What is going on in the U.S. educational system that we should be worried about?
Well, I think we should be worried about the entire educational system, not just what's going on there. If you look at the people who created it, almost to a man, they all told us what their agenda was. It was to turn the children into little socialists, little communists, little humanists, and away from traditional American values, biblical morality, and these really cornerstones of what America was founded on. And so I think the entire edifice is a threat to our freedom, to our nation, to our children, to our families. And when you look at what's happening there now, I think it's becoming even more clear to people. They're bringing in the LGBT indoctrination. They're bringing in, the drag queen story hours. The stuff that's going on in the public schools today, I think, would shock even the most liberal, progressive parent. Half of the kids graduating can't even read. That's according to the government's own data. 50% of American adults now are illiterate. This is mind-blowing, right?
Wait, how many percent of American adults are illiterate?
50%. In 1993, the federal government did a literacy study, and they categorized Americans into 5 categories. 1 being completely and totally illiterate, couldn't read a stop sign to save your life. 2 being, basically a functionally illiterate. 5 being a good reader. Half of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. They did another survey 10 years later, same result, about half of Americans can't read. And in some places it's even worse. Washington, D.C., the government's own data shows that 2/3, in fact more than 2/3 of the adult population is functionally illiterate. And this is mind-blowing. I taught my 6-year-old children to read.
It is mind-blowing.
Yep. They spend 12 years in a government school. We spend $150,000, $200,000, and these kids are graduating. They can't even read their high school diploma. Now, anybody who tells you that's an accident doesn't know what they're talking about. This is absolutely deliberate. It can be proven. We reprinted one of the essays in this book here by John Dewey, the founding father of America's government school system, explaining that, basically they want to dumb down the children. We don't need to teach the little kids how to read, write, and do math. We really just need to socialize them, but we need to do it without people noticing, because otherwise there's going to be a violent reaction. So we reprinted that essay in here just because it's so hard to believe until you've seen the evidence.
It's extremely hard to believe, but it would sound like you're kind of handicapping the society and the nation severely. Why would you do that?
That's a very good
forgive
question.
me. I mean, first of all, this stat, to me, it's a jaw-dropping thing. It's been around since 1993. I don't even know what to say. And secondly, that it's deliberate, just strains credulity.
Yeah. Well, the story of how it all happened is in here, and I can give you the kind of condensed version. There was a Reverend Golodet, who he was running a school for deaf children with the absolute best of intentions. He set out trying a new strategy for teaching reading, because the way normal people learn how to read our alphabet is through phonics. Each letter represents 1 or more sounds, and so to teach a child to read, you need to teach them what sounds each letter makes, how you blend those together, and then how you decode the word. Well, deaf children can't hear sounds, and so this reverend who was taking care of deaf children figured out, hey, I'll just teach them to memorize whole words as if the words themselves were a symbol, kind of like the Chinese writing system. Right. It's completely different from our writing system, which is based on phonetic characters. And so for deaf children, this was a really big improvement. A very smart person can memorize hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 words, and so that opens up reading to them in a way that wasn't possible before. Well, Horace Mann, who really was the pioneer of setting up government schools in America, he started off as the education commissioner in Massachusetts. He got this idea from the Prussian dictatorship, really, that the government ought to educate all the children and equalize all men and get the Bible out, etc. And he thought, why don't we try out this reading method in the new government schools that we've created in Boston? Well, they did, and within a few years, all the headmasters of all the schools in Boston said, we're not going to do this anymore. It doesn't work, right? The kids were developing what today we would call dyslexia. They couldn't read properly because that's not how you teach reading. Even a really smart kid cannot memorize, 8,000 words that would be necessary to be able to properly understand the written language that we have.
Right.
And so That was completely discredited. I mean, you can read the essay today. It was my colleague who I wrote this with, Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, put together a book in 1973 called The New Illiterates, and he actually reprinted that essay that the Boston schoolmasters wrote. They said this change proposed by Mr. Mann is not called for, it's not sustained by sound reasoning, it doesn't work, we're not going to do it anymore. And so completely discredited. I mean, just throw it on the ash heap of history, it doesn't work, let's not do it again. Well, then John Dewey, who I mentioned, he was inspired by the Soviet Union, by the way. He went to the Soviet Union. He loved what Lenin was doing, instilling a collectivistic mentality into the children. He wanted to replicate that in the United States. He resurrected this quackery that Horace Mann had tried out, knowing full well that it wasn't going to work. So they set up an experimental school with Rockefeller money, and the kids graduated unable to read and write. And incredibly, they said, hey, that's perfect. Let's do it all across the nation. So they put together readers like Dick and Jane, which handicapped millions of Americans. It became a big scandal back in 1955 because Rudolph Flesch wrote the book Why Johnny Can't Read, and he blew the lid off all this. He said, this is ridiculous. This way of teaching reading flies in the face of all logic, all common sense, and yet it's being taught in every public school in America. Something's wrong. And so this caused a national uproar. They were exposed. They had to retreat slightly. They said, oh, we'll introduce phonics again, at least a little bit. And then again in 1973, Dr. Blumenfeld put out The New Illiterates. Another scandal ensued. And yet still to this day, under Common Core, they have children in kindergarten memorizing sight words. Now, anybody who thinks that's an accident or that, you know, somehow after thousands of years of teaching people to read, we forgot how to do it, you know, I just say that's preposterous. It's ludicrous.
So, but this is somehow well-intentioned to create some kind of, so this is, you know, the title of your book is provocative. It's suggesting there's kind of a utopian vision behind what's happening to the schools. We haven't even gotten into the other stuff. We're just talking about literacy here. Yeah. So this is somehow well-intentioned. Someone's trying to create a better society by making sure people can't read properly? Well, I don't get it.
I don't think that it's well-intentioned. Robert Owen, he was one of the earliest socialists. In fact, he was a socialist before Karl Marx came along. Okay. And he had come over from Scotland. He set up a colony in Indiana called the New Harmony Colony. And it was an absolute failure. They said, we're going to try communism here before the term communism existed. Right. They called it a social system where you wouldn't have private property. Everything would be kind of communal and collective. It was a miserable failure. And so Robert Owen went back to the drawing board. He said, the problem is not with the idea of communism. The problem is that people are raised in a selfish environment. They're given an education that turns them into little individualists when really they need to be collectivists. So his organization actually branched out, and instead of focusing on founding a communist colony, they said, we need to set up a national system of government schools where we can prepare these children for a future of collectivism. And Horace Mann got his inspiration, actually the King of Prussia got his inspiration from Robert Owen. He actually wrote him a thank you letter. And so you could say Robert Owen was well-intentioned. He rejected Christianity, he rejected God, he rejected private property. I mean, he rejected all the things that I would consider good. But I think clearly from his writings, he believed what he was doing was good. He thought human nature was actually good, whereas the traditional American ethos has always been kind of Calvinistic. You know, humans are innately depraved and our heart is desperately wicked. Well, Robert Owen didn't believe that. He thought that was a product of our environment, and that if you could get the children young, you could train them to create what the Soviets later called the new Soviet man, right? Someone who wouldn't think of themselves, but only the collective. And so in that sense, you know, maybe you could say they were well-intentioned. I think the current crop of people who insist on teaching our children with this quackery masquerading as reading instruction, I think they know full well the damage that they're doing, and I think it's very deliberate. As a Christian, I think the agenda is almost self-evident. The very first education law we ever had in what is today the United States was actually passed in the 1640s by the very, very religious people of what was then the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And
okay, tell me what this is.
Well, it was the first education-related act that was ever passed in what became the United States. It was passed back in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, settled by very, very religious people who had come across from Europe. And the premise of the legislation, it's actually written in the law, it was passed by their legislature, that old deluder, Satan, one of the chief projects of Satan, they said, was to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures. You know, they had in mind, you know, burning people at the stake for trying to translate the Bible into the languages of the common people. But they said one of the chief projects of Satan is to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures. And so what we need in this colony is to make sure everybody can read so that they can read the scriptures so that Satan cannot deceive them.
Fascinating.
And so what happens if you have most of your population that's illiterate. Well, they're not going to be reading their Bibles. They're not going to be reading their Constitution or their Declaration of Independence. They're not going to be reading genuine history books or even primary source documents. They'll be turning to fake news like CNN, or they'll be relying on government teachers in government schools to teach them. And so this creates an enormous problem from the perspective of handing on our traditions, passing on our religious values, maintaining our political institutions and our freedoms. And I think almost self-evidently that's the goal, is to quote a more recent figure, Barack Obama, to fundamentally transform the United States. They would never have been able to advance the socialist agenda, the size and the scope of government in the way that we've seen, without having dumbed down the American population.
This is really fascinating, but very much so now that you frame it this way, it does make people much more susceptible to indoctrination, because it's harder for them to find the alternate perspective that they may have to consider. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, now you have YouTube, which is, one positive development. People who are illiterate can still go watch videos and learn something, but there's a lot of garbage on YouTube as well, as you know. And, I think there's no substitute for going back and reading the Constitution, or reading the Bible, or reading the Declaration of Independence. It's a totally different thing to read it for yourself than it is to hear it from some Marxist political science professor.
Well, the ability, let's say the democratization of the written word, right, through I guess the Gutenberg Bible and everything that followed, was a transformative event and civilization-changing event, right?
It was. And if you look at America, it came out of a society that was overwhelmingly Christian and that was overwhelmingly literate. Far more Americans were literate at the time of our war for independence than are today. Based on the government's data. There's a lot of literacy data, and I've tracked it down from all different sources. There was people who did studies at the time, there's people who've gone back and tried to do studies. Just read the Federalist Papers, and you get a sense of just how advanced the education these people were receiving long before we had a $1 trillion per year government education system. And one of the defining characteristics was, of course, high literacy. Children learned how to read long before they ever set foot in a school. They learned from their parents on a farm using very, very simple tools that anybody could use, like the Blueback Speller or the New England Primer. Very, very simple tools that you could get at the general store for almost no money. And they were overwhelmingly Christian. They had this belief that they were created by God, that God had given them certain rights and responsibilities, including private property and things like that. And so that's what America emerged from. And very clearly, there's no debate about it whatsoever. The people who set up our government school system vehemently disagreed with that. They wanted to move us toward a more Soviet-style system. And in fairness to John Dewey, he was operating very late 1800s, early 1900s. He had not seen yet the horrors that would be unleashed by these kinds of ideas in the Soviet Union, in communist China, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Cuba, take your pick. So in fairness to him, he maybe didn't know that hundreds of millions of people would end up slaughtered or killed as a result of shortages through these kinds of ideas. So you might say he was well-intentioned. I think his premises were all wrong,
right.
But you might say he was well-intentioned. I wouldn't, but...
Oh, it's very interesting. So Alex, this is just one of the crimes of the educators that you document in your book. And for me, it's almost like full stop, this emergency, and this is just one thing.
Yeah.
And you document how many issues in your book?
A whole range of crimes. Everything from the drugging of children to the abuse of children to exposing them to obscene and pornographic materials to encouraging them to fornicate and get abortions. It's just endless. But among the most serious, I would say, is child abuse. We consider deliberately handicapping a child for life with illiteracy to be abusive in an extreme way. You handicap that child literally for the rest of their life. You make the written word inaccessible to them. You make their career prospects much dimmer. That's unconscionable. And then even beyond that, when you're trying to subtly, through deception, through fraud, overthrow our political institutions, overthrow our freedom, not openly, not by saying, hey guys, my idea is we should all give up our freedom and live in a collectivist society, but surreptitiously by indoctrinating young people. Back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan put together a commission, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, and they came out with a report, A Nation at Risk. And they said, not me, that if a foreign power had done this to us through the educational system, we would have viewed it as an act of war. And what Dr. Blumenfeld and I argued is that we should view it as an act of war. It was a calculated and strategic effort to overthrow our system of government, and you know, I consider collectivism to be slavery, and so these people were trying to enslave us.
Oh, fascinating body of work. Alex, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Jen.